Tourists come from all over the world, pay money to watch these bison get herded in sort of an old Wild West fashion with cowboys and cowgirls. And the bison come sweeping down the plains, the earth shakes, they get moved into corrals, and then we all go eat bison burgers afterwards. But the point is, the park is making money from the tourism on bison, and then about a month later, they auction off a portion of that bison to private ranchers, and they're also making money that way. All that money goes back into Custer State Park to pay for operations of the park. So the bison are paying their own way in the case of Custer.
More benefit from profit. Thank you, Brian Yablonsky. Coming up, how government made the Indians poor and how private property made America rich.
Now shattering conventional wisdom, John Stossel.
Have you ever been to an Indian reservation? If you have, you probably saw serious poverty and alcoholism and drug abuse. Is it because there's something about Indians that makes them lazy or irresponsible? No. When Indians own their own land, they do about as well as other Americans. Manny Jules wants to see more of that. He was chief of the Kamloops Indian Band in Canada for 16 years. Manny, why are so many Indians so poor?
Well, first of all, John, nobody chooses poverty. One of the things that's happened is we've been legislated out of the economy by the federal governments, both in the United States and Canada.
What do you mean they've been taking care of you? That sounds like the best deal.
By taking care of us, that means providing social welfare programs. The only way to break the cycle of poverty, I believe, is by the recognition that every other Canadian and American takes for granted, and that's real property rights.
So in Canada, as in much of the U.S., reserves are owned by the government.
Yes.
So the Indian has some piece of paper that says, this is my lot.
But underlying that title is the fact that in Canada, the federal government owns the land.
So you can't borrow against it.
You can't borrow, you can't get a mortgage, you can't be bonded. There's nothing that you can have that'll allow you to be able to go to the bank on your own without the minister co-signing that loan.
Let's bring another guest from PERC, economist Terry Anderson, into this. Terry, you find Indians do much better when they own their own land.
Yes, John. I first got interested in this subject in 1976 when I visited a member of the Flathead Indian Reservation. And while visiting his house, I noted just how well off he was. He was not in poverty, and I asked, how do you explain this? And I'll never forget him leaning across the table, resting his chin on his hand and elbow, saying, I own this place. And that was my first introduction to the fact that many reservations in the United States do have some fee simple land, that is privately owned land like you and I own our houses. And the Indians that have privately owned land do much, much better. Their land is way more productive than the land that is overseen by the federal government, held in trust.
40 to 90% more productive, you've found.
Yes, the statistics are just astounding. I've done a lot of gathering of those data, and they show that, that fee simple lands are anywhere from 40 to 90% more productive than the lands held in trust. And as Manny said, these Indians who have their land under the trusteeship of the federal government can't borrow against them. They are really locked into a poverty cycle as a result.
It is pretty amazing that no group has been more taken care of by big government than the Indians, and no group in America has done worse.
Fundamentally, the root of the problem is the fact that we don't have the same property rights as others take for granted. And that has to fundamentally change. We have to be able to recognize the collective ownership by the tribe or the band and free the imagination of the individual entrepreneur. We've had economies that went back many, many millennia and were successful until 1492.
And Terry, you found that Indians had a form of property rights before white settlers came here and messed that up.
Before contact with whites, Indians were very much aware of markets and trading and property rights. Some Indians actually own the salmon streams. They manage those streams so that they let the larger salmon go up to spawn, and the result is that even today those streams have larger salmon than the streams that were held in commons, owned by everyone and hence managed by no one.
The clan, not an individual Indian, but a clan would own the stream. And why today would they still have more salmon?
That just goes back to what was superior management over a century ago. And at the same time, I should note, we are mismanaging our salmon stocks by chasing them around the ocean, open ocean, and over-harvesting salmon and many other fish species. We could learn from what the Native Americans did to husband their resources.
And you say you can see the private property difference just by driving through some Indian land.
Oh, it's fascinating to drive through a reservation in the West. Recently, I drove through the Crow Indian Reservation in south central Montana, and when you would come to a fence line and on one side see overgrazing, a few scrawny cattle, maybe a house, and if so, not a very livable house. Right next door, you would see cultivated fields, irrigation systems, beautiful barn, home, and so on. And you don't even need to look at the property records to know that the productive one is held in private and the other one is held in common, in trust by the federal government.
Indians on both sides of the road, but private property on one. And you can even see it from the Google Maps, the difference.
You can see it from the Google Maps. It's fascinating to just Google a reservation, the Blackfeet Reservation, the Crow Reservation.
Here's Blackfeet. There's not much development, very few farms. Here's one where they have private property rights.
You can see the same thing on Manny's reserves, where they have managed to develop an industrial park. They're creating jobs, creating wealth, and at least getting 1 foot up the ladder out of poverty.
Manny, I'll give you the last word on this.
Yeah, well, what we have to do is reverse 500 years of colonization, put First Nations, Indian tribes in the driver's seat. We can be successful where the federal and governments in both countries have failed. And the only way that that ultimately can be resolved is by granting us the right to be able to own our own lands.
Thank you, Terry Anderson. Thank you, Manny Jules. Coming up, we return to my local park. Why is it so nice when so many parks are a mess? But next, how clever ways to mark property help make America rich. Now, I want to introduce you to one of the most impressive people I know. I first met him maybe 15 years ago. It was one of those lunches with some economist from South America, had some ideas about solving poverty. I go to lunches like that because it bugs me that America's so rich. Well, most of the world is poor, and the world hasn't figured out a way to give them what it was that gave us the power to prosper. So I go to the lunch. I'm skeptical, but there sits Hernando de Soto of the Institute for Liberty and Democracy. It's a think tank based in Peru, and he starts pulling these pictures out of his briefcase. The pictures show slum dwellings built on top of each other, much like this. And de Soto went on to explain, well, I'll let you explain it. What do these pictures show?
These pictures show that roughly about 4 billion people in the world actually build their homes and own their businesses outside the legal system, so it's all haphazard and disorganized. But because of the lack of rule of law, the precision, the definition of who owns what, and because they don't have addresses, can't get the credit, can't get
What do you mean they don't have addresses?
Well, to get an address, somebody's got to recognize that that's where you live. That means that there's legal recognition. Legal recognition means property. When you've got property, you know you've got mailing addresses, and when you make a deal with someone, you can be identified. At the end, the first characteristic, the second characteristic of identity is your address. You go anywhere, they say, what's your name? And the second thing is, where do you live? Until property is defined by law, they can't get into the kind of deals or the division of labor, which is cooperation with other people to specialize and create wealth, because that's what makes you wealthy. The fact that you don't have to milk a cow every day, you don't have to work your land every day, you don't have to build your own house. You can stick to doing a TV program, or you can do this part of a BlackBerry, and the whole market puts it together. These guys can't. They've got to do their whole building, take care of it, and they can't specialize, and that's the reason of their poverty. The day that they get titled, the day that the businesses in their homes, the sewing machines, the cotton gins, whatever it is they've got there, the car repair shop, finally gets recognized, they can start expanding. They can start using scale.
But they need to be recognized by someone, local authority, who says this is yours.
They need to work within the law.
Many of these places barely have law.
That's right.
So they take a risk. They just work a deal with the guy on the first floor and they build their house on the second floor?
That's right. Probably the guy on the first floor who had the guts to squat and make a deal with someone from government who decided to look the other way has got an invisible property right. You know, it's not very different from when you Americans started going west all the way to California. Like, for example, the California gold rush. The land didn't belong to them. Hey, the country didn't belong to them. It was Mexico. But you went in there, you put 800 mining claims association, 3 million Americans, big guns, and after a while you decided, why keep on shooting at each other? So between 1848, say 1856, and the beginning of the 20th century, you went out, created a private property system that brought in banks, and you created prosperity.
But California really got rich, and the rest of the world hasn't. What's the difference?
Because you Americans at that time were absolutely conscious of what the rule of law was about, and as people kept on moving from the East Coast to the West Coast, Washington, George Washington, your first president, called them banditti. You bandits don't have a right to be there, and Congress came around and said, oh yes they do. And you started awarding property on the basis of improvements.
We didn't always have deeds in America. Before deeds and rule of law, American settlers worked out their own generally accepted rights to property.
So in certain areas of the United States, they had tomahawk rights, which meant those areas where you shaved off part of a tree, probably somebody else shaved part of the same tree to indicate that they had accepted it. In some cases where they grew corn, for example, the corn grew from here to there, and that established a right from here to there. So those were actually called corn rights. It was an improvement on the land that gave you the title to it because you had worked it.
China is still developing such property rights.
But in much of the countryside, the past prevails, and the land is owned collectively.
The whole notion of property rights has been pretty alien to formerly socialist countries because right from the beginning, Marx said it. In the 19th century, property is theft.
But compare the countryside to cities like Shanghai.
I visited Shanghai about 30 years ago, and none of these buildings existed at that time. It's incredible what happens when you just change the rules of the game.
What should the rules of the game be?
The rules of the game have to say and recognize who really owns what. Because how you relate to the assets you have determines how you relate to your neighbor and the rest of the world. We work on paper and plastic, and if you don't have what you own on paper and plastic, you will not be recognized according to standard rules and you can't play the game.
This idea of a deed protecting property seems simple, but it's very powerful, allows all this commerce between total strangers that wouldn't happen otherwise. It applies to more than just skyscrapers and factories. We at Fox Business cover stock markets. DeSoto taught me that they only work because of deed-like paperwork that we trust because we have rule of law.
What I'm trading today is roughly 1,000 futures contracts. That represents about 40,000 head of cattle. I never see this cattle. I actually have never been outside of Chicago to the west to see where these animals are.
In the United States and Western Europe, your documents go to the market and practically work for you and think for you. In the developing countries and most of the former Soviet Union, the majority of people actually have to bring their animals to market. People in the developing world have cattle, land, and houses the same way they do in the Western world. What is missing is the rule of law.
And you say if they just had rule of law, they'd be as rich as we?
Oh yes, of course. But let me tell you, bringing in the rule of law is no easy thing. You're trying it now in Iraq, you ain't getting there. You're trying in Afghanistan, you're not getting there.
You started your work in Peru, trying to establish property rights there. You were an economic advisor to the president, and you reformed permit laws to the extent that other countries now invite you to go to, you've gone to Russia, Libya, you met with Gaddafi.